So what I thought I'd do today was explain a little bit how this robot that Brett was talking about actually works. So what I mean by that is the robot that's supposed to replace the state in kind of mediating our relations as atomic individuals. But before that, just to respond a little bit to some of the stuff that Brett was talking about, this kind of, I mean, not only are there two different versions of decentralization going on between like a kind of past, let's say, localism movement or current localism movement and the kind of new emergent understanding of decentralization as you see in blockchain, but you see a lot of like other terms surfacing in the blockchain scene where you also have this strange feeling of like, hang on, that used to mean the opposite. So for example, autonomy and autonomous in a similar way used to mean like we take back control over the decision-making processes around things that affect us. Autonomous in the sense of a decentralized autonomous organization, which some of you might have heard of in blockchain systems, is again the exact opposite. It is totally out of our control. It's something that we're unable to stop or influence or in any other manner kind of decide on, and that's a design feature. It's meant to be that way. And you see the same thing with a term like disintermediation, which I also find kind of interesting. In peer-to-peer networks, this idea that, you know, we disintermediate, we get rid of the state so we can have direct relations with each other, when actually, like, you look at the actual media that's put in place, the mediums that are put in place in blockchain systems, it's like layers and layers of complex intermediation actually happening in order for these systems to work, right? So that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about. I would like to talk a little bit about, I guess the main points that I'll try and make is, well, let's say the reason why I want to explain the kind of robust system is to show that decentralization is something that is encoded, and it's encoded differently depending on your understanding of decentralization and depending on what you're aiming to achieve with decentralization. So when I was first asked to speak, I was a little bit annoyed because the word decentralization is something that, you know, I work in the cryptocurrency scene, and it's something that I'm constantly having to kind of engage with and meet in situations like the startup scene and different meetups where, you know, you'll hear the same story over and over again, and it'll be like, there is this problem, we're going to use a blockchain to solve it, and we're solving it by decentralizing it. The question of whether a given problem is actually a problem or not, and whether blockchain is the right solution for that or not, and what specific meaning of decentralization is actually being employed in that specific blockchain protocol is never really fully addressed. So it's this constant like, why can't we get a bit more precision on the term decentralization so that we understand what it is that we're actually trying to achieve with this, with these new systems. And so I am lucky enough to be working with the UCL Computer Sciences Department at the moment. And one of the things that they're trying to do is establish a bit of a kind of clear vocabulary, a clear set of definitions for the terminology in order to actually establish a science of the internet. You can't have a science if you're throwing around words and everyone mean different things about the words. You need to have a shared vocabulary where there's clear understanding of what different concepts actually mean. So they're trying to put this vocabulary together, and what's really interesting about it is they're trying to do it in an interdisciplinary manner. So not just within a kind of computer sciences definition, but also reach out to kind of social technical studies, STS, social sciences, and so on, to put together a vocabulary that will somehow bring a kind of interdisciplinary but scientifically rigorous approach on these decentralized systems that are being built. And so the first kind of way that they defined decentralization was, however, very much looking at the history of peer-to-peer technology. And it's interesting to try and understand that because it is what will allow us to understand how a concept like decentralization has come to mean the exact opposite of what we thought it meant before, right? In peer-to-peer, and the definition that they've come up with is that wait, I'll actually read out the exact definition because I have it written down here. Okay, I have messy notes, but it's basically a distributed system where there is no single authority. And so they make a distinction between distributed and decentralized, where a distributed system can still have lots of different nodes that kind of engage with each other semi-autonomously, but there is an authority that can shut down the system or not, that can block certain communication between nodes or not. In a decentralized system, that's not the case. And so in peer-to-peer, you have the peer-to-peer understanding of decentralization is you have no single authority that can intervene in the communication between nodes. And the aim of that, it's mostly about, if you're an engineer and you're designing a decentralized communication information system, you want to make sure that the information actually reaches the nodes that it needs to reach, regardless of whether someone in that network wants to stop that information. That you have these strong kind of right tendencies in the blockchain community, but you do also have a different tradition that comes from more this kind of engineering peer-to-peer, and in fact also kind of anarchist traditions within network engineering and within computer sciences, where the concerns are, it's anti-censorship basically when it comes to designing an information system like this. And so that's the definition of, let's say, coming from the history of peer-to-peer decentralized networks. That is a kind of definition of decentralization. Now, when you have a decentralized system with multiple authorities, a problem that arises if you're trying to kind of create a shared understanding of something going on in that network is how do you come to an agreement of that shared understanding? And this is a problem that, again, is very famous in decentralized network engineering, and it's called the Byzantine Generals problem. Some of you, I don't know if anyone's heard of this before? Nope, okay. But the Byzantine Generals problem is something that is kind of thrown around a lot in the Bitcoin and blockchain scene because what was phenomenal for many about Bitcoin was that it solved the Byzantine General problem. And the problem is essentially something like this. You have a city, you have some generals who want to attack the city, and they're all kind of surrounding it. The attack is only going to be successful if they all attack it at the same time. So they need to come to an agreement about when they're going to attack this city, and they're doing that by sending messages between them. But they don't know if any of the messengers are passing false messages. They don't know if they've been infiltrated, which messages to trust or which ones not to trust. So the problem is essentially how do you make sure that there is an agreement amongst the generals that now is the time to attack when you can't trust the messages that are being passed around. So this problem of creating a decentralized consensus in a network where there's potential malicious actors, let's say, was the problem that the Bitcoin consensus algorithm, proof of work, mining, you might have heard some of these words, that's what it solves. So I thought I might just kind of explain that, how it does that, if that is okay with everybody. Again, it's like, I do like to explain these things in quite a lot of detail because it really helps people understand into a system like Bitcoin and many other blockchain systems. How many have heard of mining, Bitcoin mining? Okay, so probably most people think of Bitcoin mining as a way to get Bitcoin, basically, right? Is that what most of you think? You mine some Bitcoin and then bling, it comes out, and that's how you get Bitcoin. Mining serves a very specific function, and it serves this function of creating a consensus in the decentralized network. And it does this by using something called cryptographic hashing, which is a mathematical process where you take some kind of, you take whatever data, you hash it using this kind of mathematical function, and it will spit out a number. And the number that it spits out in the mining process needs to meet certain requirements. And those requirements are kind of arbitrary in the sense that don't worry about those requirements, as in it needs to have a certain amount of zeros in front of it. So it needs to be a specific type of number. Now, finding that specific type of number can be quite hard. So what happens in the Bitcoin network is People in the network, they do some transactions. The transactions get broadcast to the network. Everyone says, yes, I've seen that transaction. Then the transaction gets grouped into blocks of transactions, which then needs to be hashed in this function and spit out a certain number. Now, in order for that number to meet the requirement, you add various other numbers to it until it meets that requirement. That's basically the mining process. Does that kind of make sense for people? Okay. Let me try it from a different angle. In Bitcoin, the reason why you have a kind of decentralized consensus problem is everyone's doing transactions, so on and so forth, but you want to make sure that everybody agrees on which transactions are valid in the network, right? The decentralized consensus problem. So step by step, what happens? Transactions are broadcast to the network. They get grouped into blocks by anybody in the network. Those blocks of transactions get put through the hashing function, and it will spit out a number. Now, that block will only be considered valid if the number meets the requirement. So you keep trying until it meets the requirement, which means you've mined a block. And then you receive your reward. So mining is an incentivized way of validating transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain. So it's this kind of, you probably need to look at it a few times, read it over a few times until you kind of fully grasp it. But it's a very kind of interesting piecing together of concepts from market economy, meaning people are going to be self-interested, therefore they're going to want to get the Bitcoin reward, therefore they're going to want to mine blocks on the blockchain. So we're going to operationalize that along with cryptography, along with the decentralization of the network. And they use that as a way to solve the Byzantine problem, Byzantine Generals problem, which is how do you create consensus in a decentralized network. Now, if you're not with me, that's completely fine.
There's good websites. If anybody does want the really technical stuff, there's this guy from Princeton University, I think, called Unders. So there's websites like unders.com, /blockchain, and he goes through all the technical components, and he has a video that goes along with it. So you can actually, if you're interested in learning the technical stuff, you can go through it. It's interactive and it's super. Yeah. It's actually, he does it in a very intuitive way, because when it's often quite hard to grapple with it.
It is. It's completely fine to not get it, and it's also completely fine to kind of carry on and doing a bit more research, because it's actually quite an interesting puzzle that they managed to solve. And there's lots of other consensus protocol designs. This is the Bitcoin this was the first moment that this was solved through this kind of design. But yeah, if you go online, there's lots of guides on this stuff now, because it is the fundamentals of cryptocurrencies, basically. But regardless of that, the main points that I want to get at is that what happens with the kind of terminology that's used in this space is, so you take a word like decentralized consensus, and...
Sorry, excuse me.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the reason it doesn't make sense is I don't understand the context of consensus. Consensus for what? For transactions to happen? Or for consensus for there to be a non-centralized body? What is the consensus for?
So the consensus is, within Bitcoin, is literally just consensus around what transactions have happened. So what transactions do all of us in the decentralized network agree on have actually happened?
Are those monetary transactions?
Yeah. So Bitcoin, as in
so
I send you a Bitcoin.
To really make money, right?
The whole point is to circulate money. So it's I send a Bitcoin from my wallet to your wallet, but if I'm just sending it from my wallet to your wallet, who says that's actually happened? How do we agree on that that's actually happened? How does everyone else agree on that that's actually happened? That's the consensus that they're trying to solve. But the main point that I would like to arrive at is that it's a very specific form of consensus. There's a very specific aim for that consensus. And it's a very specific encoding around how you arrive at it, which is literally competition. It's literally competition plus lottery. You have to be kind of lucky, and you have to kind of run a lot of computations very quickly in order to be able to mine this block. So consensus again, it's one of those words where it's like, it used to mean that, okay, we all sit around and we discuss something until we come to an agreement about it, something along those lines, right? That, okay, we all agree on, you know, because we've talked about it and we agree on it. In the Bitcoin system, there is no such kind of deliberation process. There's no kind of like, common understanding in that sense. It's literally just a lottery. So the way they've solved the problem of having a single authority deciding this has in fact happened and decentralizing that to a kind of common agreement is by taking turns through a lottery. So it's like I get to determine which transactions are valid and true this time around. Next time you get to decide that because you've won the lottery. Next time you get to decide that because you won the lottery.
It's really a form of gambling.
It's a form of gambling, and it's using gambling. It's using gambling as a way to create a kind of machine for generating consensus on a kind of ongoing basis. So this is just to give you guys an idea of like this is a very obviously we're talking about a very specific form of decentralization, a very specific form of consensus. But what is powerful about these kinds of words like decentralization, consensus, autonomy, and so on and so forth, is that it allows for anybody else to put their own kind of meaning into it. So Bitcoin has solved the problem of decentralized consensus in a kind of network computational sense. But because we're using those words to talk about these things, then all of a sudden everybody can be very excited about Bitcoin and be like, oh, then we can use that to solve decentralized consensus across all these other areas too, in terms of, whatever else, without actually closely analyzing what the effects are of using a system that is basically operationalizing gambling on a computational network in a kind of political scenario or whatever. So this is just to, is this kind of make sense? Yeah?
Jaya, can I add an analogy maybe that might help?
Sure.
Just like, because I find the best thing to maybe like think about is just like us in this room, if like every single one of you had a laptop with you and an Excel spreadsheet open, and like our job was to all like watch Jaya and like record every like action that she did on separate cells each time she did something. We could all like try to do it, but we would probably all like start to like get divergent accounts of what was happening. All right, so you'd start to like see people, we might be able to like sort of keep track at the same time, but probably you're gonna get all these like different accounts. So like normally what we have to do is like find a way, like in normal centralized systems, you have somebody who's like the definitive account of what's happened. And you go to that person, you say, tell me what Jaya said at this particular point, and this definitive person will tell you the authoritative account. If you're trying to do it amongst all these people who are simultaneously trying to do it, you have to find a consensus mechanism. Otherwise, you're all going to have like different accounts of what's happened. So essentially, all this technology is around like, if we were doing it in a room like this, we'd probably all just like try to like shout out to each other, like, hey, do we agree about what's happened? But if you're doing it with like 10,000 strangers across the internet, you have to have these sort of like new mechanisms in order to get everybody on the same page about a particular issue. So that might, I don't know if that's a helpful analogy.
Yeah. But so, again, the main point that I want to make, apart from this thing that concepts travel, and they travel very easily across fields, and that traveling of those concepts has kind of very funny, strange, and weird effects, and very powerful effects. So that, decentralization is one of these concepts, and so that's, where you have a situation of a very specific problem of decentralization within network computation that then can become all of a sudden the solution to all these other problems of decentralization, and bring, it's powerful. Who knows how that's going to actually play out, but it is powerful. It's powerful enough to bring kind of hackers and CEOs, anarchists and bankers into the same room, talking to each other in very kind of excited ways, and that's actually what's happening in the blockchain space. So it's a very interesting space. There are also other consensus protocols that are coming out. It's not all based on gambling. So if you look at blockchain, there are other protocols coming out. proof of stake, proof of cooperation, and so on. And there's also non-blockchain based kind of ways of using kind of hashing and so on to create kind of decentralized records of events.
Can you give us some examples of how blockchain relate to actual changes in the political economy, now that we all understand it?
How it...
Yeah, some actual examples of how you could apply, blockchain type systems to the political economy, rather than just, validating Bitcoin transactions.
Yeah. What aspect of the political economy? Well, I mean...
Political system or...
Yeah.
Voting, for example.
Yeah, in voting... I mean, to me, one example that I wanted to talk about is probably not going to be super satisfactory to you, but I wanted to talk about it just in order to kind of bring together a little bit, again, this kind of early on, to show a bit how the history of peer-to-peer technology as being concerned with anti-censorship has also kind of filtered into Bitcoin and blockchain. And it is this idea that, Bitcoin, as a peer-to-peer money system, the intention is to create a kind of value transfer system that can't be censored. Meaning, the kind of example that people bring up a lot is WikiLeaks, where they had kind of financial embargoes against them by Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, and so on. Probably kind of 3 minutes, okay. In response to when they released the war logs and about the U.S. involvement in or killing of civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan. Sorry, I'm being a little bit distracted. But so what you had there was a situation of where it became quite clear that there was certain controls of global value systems, and then you have Bitcoin kind of come in as a potential way to get value and donations to WikiLeaks, regardless of kind of geopolitical control of those kind of value flows. So, it's something that has been used kind of strategically in that sense, but that's I think more what you're asking is in terms of replacing existing systems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Models of governance.
Yeah.
That sounds like, just a way of fundraising.
Yeah, which can be powerful,
Right.
but I think we should get back to this in the question session, but I should pass on to